Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we'll discuss Acquainted with the Night by Robert Frost. Robert Lee Frost was an American poet. His work was initially published in England before it was published in America. Known for his realistic depictions of rural life and his command of American colloquial speech, Frost frequently wrote about settings from rural life in New England in the early 20th century, using them to examine complex social and philosophical themes. So, in his early years, he was a dropout of school. He left his school and he worked with his mother. Then he wrote a poem, and that was sold to a newspaper in his adult years. And then his grandfather bought a farm where he was supposed to live and tend and take care of it. So he spent 9 years there. And in those 9 years, Frost kept writing his poems, and his farming also became successful. Meanwhile, he married a girl, and it was a good change in his life. But most of his life, apart from being a poet, was a tragic one. His mother died. His father died in very early age. And his sister died, and she was before death she was admitted in mental hospital because she was mentally retarded. And Frost had a daughter who was also mentally retarded, and she died. So on the whole, Frost had a very complex and tragic life. So his tragedy is sometimes obvious. His being alone, his loneliness is sometimes conspicuous through his poems. Moreover, we can see an addition of his personal life in certain poems regarding the regional effect that we see. That most of his poems, especially written in the time of New England, where he spent 9 years, he talks about all those areas, region, society, birds, animals, sceneries, snow. So all the things, all the settings that he saw in New England, he discusses them all. As far as his works are concerned, they're discussed in the next slide, but to tell you about them in short, that he received Pulitzer Prizes and his works were well known. His poems were hallmark of American literature. And the themes mostly that he uses are, like, he talks about snow, which is a dominant symbol. He talks about loneliness, which is again a dominant symbol. Then he talks about the inner loneliness of a person versus external environment. So that is again a big theme for Frost. So we find conflict in most of the poems of John Keats. There's external or internal conflict, there's conflict of ideologies, there's conflict of theories, there's conflict of two opposing ideas, there's conflict of making a choice. So we find conflict in most of his poems. We find escapism in Frost's poems. He talks about going to escapism to his imagination, but his escapism is unlike that of John Keats. Keats wants to go to escapism, but he doesn't want to come back. Frost knows that Earth is the place to live, so he wants to go to escapism and he wants to come back to the world. So this is where they are diverting from each other. So Frost is a lover of nature, so nature is again a vivid theme of the poetry of Robert Frost. So he talks about nature, and he talks about that regional era where he spent 9 years. So as far as his achievements are concerned, he received Pulitzer Prizes in 1924 for New Hampshire, a poem with notes and grace notes, 1931 for collected poems, 1937 for the range, 1943 for a witness tree. So 4 times he got Pulitzer Prizes. He was Poet Laureate of Vermont. He was Nobel Prize nominee for 31 times. And President John F. Kennedy, he used remarks for Robert Frost that he is the national American poet. So this was a big remark for Frost. I have been one acquainted with the night. I have walked out in rain and back in rain. I've outwalked the furthest city light. I've looked down the saddest city lane. I have passed the watchman on his beat and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came over houses from another street. But not to call me back or say goodbye. And further there at an unearthly height, a luminary clock against the sky proclaimed the time was neither wrong nor right. I have been one acquainted with the night. Well, Francis Bacon says that men are afraid of death as children are afraid of going into the dark. So, the darkness is a mysterious thing, and that is always mysterious because in dark we are unable to see things. So, sometimes we tend to have fear. So, that is either fear of the dark or the fear of loneliness in the dark. So here the poet is outside, he is not sitting inside his house, he is moving around, and it is raining, and the rain is there in the New England where the poet is living. So you have to imagine his plight, you have to imagine his condition, that he is living in America. It is a winter night and it is the night of New England, which is very cold area, and then it is raining and it is time of night then. So altogether the things are making it very mysterious kind of atmosphere where the poet is like not only the poet but anyone else would not dare go out of the house. But at this time the poet is out, he's not feeling cold, he's not feeling afraid, he is going outside in the rain and he is not taking care of the rain as well. So he says, I have been one acquainted with the night. Now, acquainted is a word used for familiarity, that we are familiar with something. So the poet is familiar with the night, the poet is familiar with the dark, he's not afraid of it. He's not afraid of being alone in that dark. So he says, I have walked out in rain and back in rain, that I am walking on the street, I'm going away from my house, I'm coming back towards my house, and I have outwalked the farthest city light. So in the whole area there, if I find a light on, I have even crossed that. Like I have crossed altogether the lane of or the streets of my city, and I have come back in rain. So it is raining and it is not affecting him. The reason is that we'll be discussing later on. So he says that I have looked down the saddest city lane. Saddest city lane here means the most silent lane where there is no movement at all. So he has been through that lane as well. And I passed by the watchman on his beat. And at night time, most of the times there are watchmen, security guards who are there to take care of the place. So they are moving, there is a watchman who is moving basically, and he is looking at the poet who is moving at this time of night, and he is himself shocked to see him and dropped my eyes, unwilling to explain. The poet is not wanting to face him, or he is not willing to explain him that why is he out at this hour and in this atmosphere. So he is not able to tell him, or he is unwilling to tell him his condition or his reason for being out at this hour. So their watchmen are conscious of this thing, that unwanted people at this time of the night should not be wandering about. So poet is a bit afraid of this thing as well. Moreover, he is not willing to tell him his condition. Then he says that I have stood still and stopped the sound of feet when far away an interrupted cry came our houses from another street. So the poet here comments that I was walking, and since I was lost in my thoughts were broken, my imagination broke, or I came to reality while walking, when I listened to a shriek, a cry that came from houses far away. So it was the only sound that he could listen apart from the sound of his own feet while he was walking. But not to call me back or say goodbye. So then he realized that though he listened to a voice apart from the sound of his feet, but that cry was not meant for him. The cry was not uttered to call him back or say goodbye. And further, still at unearthly height, and on at an unearthly height, like in the sky, where we cannot have a reach, one luminary clock against the sky. So luminary clock is moon. He is referring to moon. That moon is shining in the sky, proclaimed. So moon was like giving this gesture or claiming that the time was neither wrong nor right. So the time has got nothing to do with this fact, what the poet was going through. Sometimes we utter that this is my bad time, I am in trouble. So time has got nothing to do with the things. Weather has got nothing to do with the things. Poet says, I have been one, acquainted with the night. The problem is not with the time, the problem is with me. I am the person who has created familiarity with the dark, with the night time. So this poem is about the loneliness of the poet. The darkness here is symbolic of the speaker's loneliness and depression, that he, like we have already discussed, that he spent a life of depression. His mother, his sister, his daughter, they died. His father died in a very early age. So all these things added up to this thing that he was not having a company in his childhood, and even this time he was alone. And he was alone, he was walking. So he is a person who is acquainted with the night, who is moving about in the streets in night time, and he has got no friend there. Or maybe he was expecting someone to stop him when he stepped out of his house in the rain in such a terrible atmosphere. But no one stopped him. And when he listens the sound of a cry, he stops for a moment, but he then realizes that that cry was not meant for him. So nobody was stopping him. It was rather his sound of feet that was altogether with him. No other sound was with him or was meant for him. So he is unwilling to explain the watchman why he is out, because he is himself completely absorbed in his emotions. His inner self is he's too much preoccupied with his inner self that he is unable to make out what the outer climatical conditions are. At such terrible time of night, he's not feeling rain, he's not feeling chilled or cold, he's not feeling that he's getting wet because of rain, because his inner emotions are much too heavier for him, that he is too much lost in his thinking, in his thoughts, that he is not taking care of the outer environment. Then he is moving from the saddest lane. So this is again that he's having no fear of being alone or no fear of going into the dark, because he's all alone. And if he passes watchman, so watchman may be at this side of the street and he may be at that side of the city. So he's all alone almost. So he's not getting afraid of the dark because his inner is lonely. So he's not afraid of the outer loneliness. So when your inner is not happy, your outer happiness will not give you any happiness. So since his inner self is feeling lonely, his outer self is not getting afraid of that loneliness. So this poem is all about his being lonely and traveling in the night. So he is not afraid of the outer atmosphere. I would like to compare this poem with another poem of Robert Frost, that is Desert Places. So in that even he is suggesting the same theme, that it is snow outside and snow is covering everything, and even the animals, like animals are wild creatures, they are not afraid of the climatical conditions. But it is such, in that poem he says that the climate is such a deadly one that even the animals are forced to get into their lairs. But I am outside and I am not afraid of this atmosphere, since I am lonely inside. So my the loneliness of my heart, of my mind, is making me unaware of the loneliness outside. So this was the paraphrase and explanation of Acquainted with the Night. I hope you understood it. So I would request you to please hit the bell icon and please subscribe this channel.